Tammy. Again, I'm waiting for the all-powerful one, your brother. Does that scare you? Let's get a count of our daily Bible readers before we start. And then if you don't have a quarterly, Barry has some in his hand. He can be glad to share one with you. This quarter, we're studying the book of Joshua. And we have to remember that Joshua was the second leader, the one that came after Moses. It fell to Joshua to lead God's people, God's chosen people, into the chosen land, into the promised land. It was a lot of pressure. He was taking over after a man who had been a good leader, a great leader. But he was able to step up and fill those shoes. And back in chapter 6, we studied the conquest, the taking of Jericho. If you've got your Bibles, turn again to Judges chapter 6. In that lesson, we studied that they followed God's commands to the letter, and it worked out perfectly for the Israelites. Everything went just the way it was supposed to be. Chapter 6, verse 20. And wait a minute, I'm in Judges. That's not going to help. Joshua 6, verse 20 and 21. So the people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets, and when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. They utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. They followed God's plan, and they got a good result. That's the lesson I think that we take from the story of Jericho. But before we go further into talk about last week's lesson and then more about this week's lesson, I want you to back up just for a minute, verses 18 and 19, because I think we see there the beginning of last week's lesson, or at least the cause for last week's lesson. Verse 18, but as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, so that you do not covet them, and take some of the things under the ban, and make the camp of Israel accursed, and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. Now think about those verses as we go into last week's lesson that Dusty taught. In last week's lesson, we saw that Joshua sent spies into a little town called Ai. The spies came back and reported, there's not many people in Ai. We only need about 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. Remember us talking about that? And maybe they were overconfident, maybe not. But when Israel went in, they were soundly defeated. And in fact, 36 Israelites got killed. But in the first verse of chapter 7, the first verse that we read in our lesson last week, it explained why it didn't work. It's because there was sin in the camp. Joshua 7, 10, 11, Joshua has been complaining to God about, why did this happen? Why did you let us go into this city if we were going to be destroyed? Don't you know our reputation, your reputation is going to be damaged because of this? People are going to laugh at your people. Joshua 7, verse 10 and 11. So the Lord said to Joshua, rise up. Why is it that you have fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them. And they have even taken some of the things under the ban, and have both stolen and deceived. Moreover, they have also put them among their own things. So God tells Joshua, here's why you all lost the battle. You went into the battle, you went into the confrontation with sin. And that's what happened. It wasn't that God left or God abandoned them. It was the fact that they did not obey. An Israelite named Achan had kept some of the spoils and hidden them under his tent. And then chapter 7 ends with the punishment of Achan and his family, and the total destruction of that branch of family. That was part of the punishment. Now, this week's lesson is a little brighter, a little happier. We went to a movie the other day, and it was, I turned to Susan at one point and I said, this is not a feel-good movie. Well, last week's lesson was not a feel-good story. This week it's a little better. So let's turn to, I want to start with Joshua chapter 8, verse 1. But if you'll turn to page 80 in the book, it picks up with verse 3. And the reason I want to start with verse 1, last week's attempt to defeat Ai, there's no record of God telling them to go do it. There's no written record of God telling them how to go do it. Here, this week, there is. Now the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear or be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you, and arise, go up to Ai. Notice, he didn't say, take you 3,000 men and we're going to do this. He said, take all your men of war. See, I have given into your hand the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king just as you did to Jericho and its king. You shall take only its spoil and its cattle as plunder for yourselves. Now we're going to talk about the differences in this between the two cities and the two plans in a few minutes. But I want to point that out, that he tells them, you all can keep the plunder this time as plunder for yourselves. So personally, they got to keep whatever they won in battle. And then he tells them how to do it. Set an ambush for the city behind it. Now, picking up in verse 3. So Joshua arose and the people of war to go up against Ai. And Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them away by night. And he commanded them, saying, behold, you shall lie in ambush against the city behind the city. Do not go very far from the city, but all of you be ready. Then I and all the people who are with me will approach the city, and it will come about when they come out against us as at the first, that we shall flee before them. For they will come out after us till we have drawn them from the city, for they will say, they are fleeing before as at the first. Therefore we will flee before them. Then you shall rise from the ambush and seize the city, for the Lord your God will deliver it into your hand, and it will be, when you have taken the city, that you shall set the city on fire. According to the commandment of the Lord you shall do. See, I have commanded you. Joshua therefore sent them out, and they went to lie in ambush, and stayed between Bethel and Ai on the west side of Ai. But Joshua lodged that night among the people. Then Joshua rose up early in the morning and mustered the people, and went up, and he and the elders of Israel, before the people of Ai. And all the people of war who were with him went up and drew near, and they came before the city and camped on the north side of Ai. Now a valley lay between them and Ai. So he took about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai and on the west side of the city. And when they had set the people, all the army that was on the north of the city and its rear guard on the west of the city, Joshua went that night into the midst of the valley. Now it happened when the king of Ai saw it that the men of the city hurried and rose early and went out against Israel to battle, but he and all his people at an appointed place before the plain. But he did not know that there was an ambush against him behind the city. And Joshua and Israel made as if they were beaten before them and fled by the way of the wilderness. So all the people who were in Ai were called together to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were drawn away from the city. There was not a man left in Ai or Bethel who did not go out after Israel. So they left the city open and pursued Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Stretch out the spear that is in your hand toward Ai, for I will give it into your hand." And Joshua stretched out the spear that was in his hand toward the city. So those in ambush arose quickly out of their place. They ran as soon as he stretched out his hand, and they entered the city and took it, and hurried to set the city on fire. And when the men of Ai looked behind them, they saw, and behold, the smoke of the city ascended to heaven. So they had no power to flee this way or that way, and the people who had fled to the wilderness turned back on the pursuers. Now when Joshua and all Israel saw that the ambush had taken the city and the smoke of the city ascended, they turned back and struck down the men of Ai. Then the others came out of the city against them, so that they were caught in the midst of Israel, some on this side and some on that side. And when they had struck them down, so that they let none of them remain or escape. But the king of Ai they took alive and brought him to Joshua. And it came to pass, when Israel had made an end of slaying all the inhabitants of Ai in the field, in the wilderness where they pursued them, and when they had all fallen by the edge of the sword, until they were consumed, that all the Israelites returned to Ai and struck it with the edge of the sword. So it was that all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. Just like he had done for Jericho, just like God had done for Jericho, he made a plan to take Ai. He laid out this ambush, and Joshua planned it out and followed through. It's my opinion. I know I'm supposed to get away from the stand when I give my opinion, but my opinion is that in verse 2, where we see where God told him about the detail or mentioned the detail, I think he put that there so we wouldn't think that it was Joshua's great plan is the thing that made this win in the battle possible. We see that God laid the plan out, and he's the one that should get the credit. It was God's victory, not man's. In fact, the lesson I think we need to see, or that we need to take home with us and we need to put into our lives, is they won the battle because they followed God's word. They followed his plan. They didn't try to improve on it. They didn't try to modify it. When they did what he said, it all worked out. Israel would conquer Ai with God's help, not without his help. But before we go any further, let's talk about the differences in the two battles for the two cities. And maybe it's a stretch to call what happened in Jericho a battle, because remember there were no rocks thrown or spears thrown or whatever. They marched around the city and the walls fell, and then Jericho was conquered. That's when they went in and killed all the people of Jericho. So they followed God's command to the letter, and as the great Aidan J. Law says, easy peasy, it all went just like it's supposed to. But in the next battle, when they tried to take Ai the first time, we see that they didn't follow God's plan. They didn't even ask God for a plan, it doesn't look like. At least we don't have a record of it. And maybe that's where they started to go wrong. Something else, another difference. In Jericho, they were told that all the silver and gold, remember me reading chapter 6, verse 18 and 19? In Jericho, they were told that all the silver and gold and bronze and iron were holy to the Lord, and they were to go into the treasury of the Lord. Now, we saw in this reading, in the case of Ai, at least for the second battle, they were told ahead of time, you get to keep the plunder. It's for your personal use. In the first battle for Ai, I've already said we had no record of them consulting God on what to do. But we know, as Dusty pointed out last week, they sinned, and because of it, they were defeated soundly. They carried this sin into the next battle, and it cost them dearly. In the latter part of verse 8, if I can get back there, we read, according to the commandment of the Lord, you shall do. See, I have commanded you. That's the lesson I want us to take home with us this morning. Find out what God's commands are, and that's what we need to do. Over and over and over again, we read stories and examples and things that just show us that's the way we have to do if we want to be successful, if we want to get through life. Sir?
This is the same God we serve today. We should not take Him lightly.
We're going to, eventually, I'm going to get around to taking God for granted. I have to believe that if taking last week's lesson, that's a lot of what happened. They took God for granted. Jericho was so easy. All they had to do was march around the city the prescribed number of times. Now, I want to point out, and we've all asked this, I know teachers forever, Bible teachers forever have asked, what would have happened if the Israelites had sat down after circling the city 6 times on the 7th day? And we all answer nothing, right? Well, we're going to get into a little more, I hope, of taking God for granted and the danger behind that. In fact, my next question, if Joshua had decided to kill the people, but leave the buildings and leave the houses because they were too nice to tear down and burn up, if I could have rationalized that in my own human mind, it would have been easy to say, God, why do we need to burn a perfectly good house? We'll just kill all the people because the army's out of town. We'll just kill everybody here and then we'll come back and use this town. Later, they get to do that. But that wasn't God's command for this particular moment. And I think you would say that if they hadn't followed what He told them to do, it wouldn't have worked out. And that's the lesson for today. Our job is to follow God's commands and not try to improve on them. There may be, most of us, when we have talked to people or have heard people say different ways to try to improve the worship service or improve this or improve that, God has laid out how we're to worship Him in spirit and in truth. And His plan is the way we need to do it, not something we come up in our own minds with. Now, one of the things, and this is kind of chasing down a rabbit trail if you ask me, but one of the things the author of the commentary and the quarterly both mentioned, look in verse 3. It says, Joshua chose 30,000 mighty men of valor and sent them away by night. Then he comes back in verse 12 and says, so he took about 5,000 men. And the authors wanted to talk about how some people seize on this and say there's a contradiction in the Bible right here. And first off, I don't believe there is because I don't believe there's contradictions in the Bible. But secondly, I'm not sure we are told the whole story if we understand if there were 30,000 total warriors or if there were 35,000 total warriors and he split them 30 and 5 and then had some more that he was with. It's not specific enough to make the argument, but I just want to point that out that some people will point to these numbers and say there's a contradiction here. It looks like they were both, the group of 30 and the group of 5, they were both set on the west side of the city of Ai. And I think the reason that's important is Bethel, which was a bigger city. And again, I'm quoting from these two authors. Bethel, which was a bigger city, may have intervened in the first battle. They may have brought some soldiers down to help them. So Joshua put a force of some size between Bethel and Ai, one to do the ambush and maybe another to hold Bethel off in case they did bring some more soldiers to help reinforce Ai's soldiers. But anyway, now to what Jackie said. Looking at last week's lesson, do you think that the children of Israel took God for granted? When you think about it, what's going to happen to anybody that takes God for granted? They're going to fail, right? I mean, that's we talk about things coming back to haunt you. That's got to come back and be a problem. We need to, as to bring this to our today, to what we do today, we need to remember, and maybe sometimes it's a small point, but we need to remember every time we pray to thank God for our blessings. We need to do that more often than we do. I know I do personally, and I'll bet all of us do. When we think about everything we have is given to us, there's no reason that we shouldn't thank Him over and over and over again. There's not enough thanks for what He's done for us, right?
You remember when the missionary down in Central America, Wayne Pruitt.
Wayne.
Wayne was down there on the coast of the city, and he come and met with us, and he said, I've got to get down there now because they're modernized. And the more they modernize, the less people I can convert. So it happened just as he said, and then he moved out into the smaller areas. But he was doing great there, and then as they modernized, they lost interest in God.
I'm so glad for the life I get to live. It's, I don't want to have to go to an outhouse every time I go to the bathroom. I don't want to have to go get water every time I want to drink. I like to flip the remote on that TV. But the other side of that is I live such a comfortable life. And if I don't give God the credit, it's pretty easy for me to sit around and be comfortable and just take it for granted. And it'll come back to haunt us. Look at verse 14 again. You kind of see the different ebbs and flows of this thing. Joshua had a plan because God gave it to him. But the king of Ai had a plan also. Verse 14. Now it happened when the king of Ai saw it. Now that's when he saw the people out front. He thought Joshua was bringing in another attack force. Now it happened when the king of Ai saw it that the men of the city hurried and rose early and went out against Israel to battle, he and all his people, at an appointed place before the plain. It seemed like the king of Ai had plans too. There was a certain place in that valley he wanted to attack them. And I don't know if it's because Ai would have the higher ground, or maybe down here where he would catch Joshua and his men, there was no cover and they were out in the open and didn't have anywhere to run. But somehow the king of Ai had a plan too that he thought would work. But according to Joshua's plan, the army of Israel made an orderly retreat, drawing that army of Ai away from the city, just as God had laid out, just as God had planned. They didn't just cut and run. And you can imagine the confusion that would have happened if somebody had sounded a trumpet and they'd just taken off running every different direction. Instead, they led Ai away from the city so the people who were doing the burning, the ambushing, could do what they did. At the proper time, Joshua stretched out his spear as a signal. Maybe from there, I don't know what happened. I doubt that, and maybe they could, but I doubt that people miles away in the city of Ai could see him holding that spear up. But maybe there were messengers that passed the word back to the ambush party. But somehow they got the word, okay, they're far enough out, Let's go attack the city. The ambushers began burning the city. The smoke from those burnings was a signal to the people who were retreating to turn and take the fight back to Ai, or back to the soldiers of Ai. And soon Ai found themselves fighting on two fronts. Now, one other verse I wanted to read that wasn't in the book, verse 26 of chapter 8. Okay, we'll pick up with 25 again. All who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. Verse 26, for Joshua did not withdraw his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had utterly destroyed all the inhabitants of Ai. This time, Joshua wasn't taking any chances. He held that spear up until the battle was over, until everything was done. And then they came in and they after having burned it all and killed all the people, they piled rocks on top of the city, and it was completely destroyed. And if you've got a Bible like mine that has the maps in the back, you'll find, in my case, they called the first map the map of the patriarchs, or the patriarchal world, or whatever. It shows Bethel and Ai on there. But if you look at the next couple of maps, you see Bethel plainly drawn on there, but there is no Ai, because Ai was completely destroyed and covered over. Now, this is completely off the lesson. Well, not completely off, but I want to tell you my mistake. You know how sometimes you read a verse or a section of the Bible and all of a sudden a light goes on and you think, man, I've read that 50 times and didn't understand what it was saying. Well, I've read the story of the first battle of Ai dozens of times at least. And I guess I always assumed that Achan stole the stuff from Ai until I got to reading the commentary that goes along with this book. And the author pointed out that Achan stole the stuff from Jericho. And when I think about it now, that makes a lot more sense. And it's also why chapter 7, Dusty talked about it a little bit last week, you know, God gave away the lead right off the bat. In chapter 7, verse 1, he says the people of Jerusalem, or of Israel, had sinned. And that's what causes this problem. Well, the sin was that Achan stole the stuff from Jericho, and we read in verse 18 and 19 where they were told the spoils, the gold, the bronze, the silver is all for the Lord and for the Lord's treasury. So that's where the sin came. And I don't know why I hadn't picked up on that years ago. And when I think about it, they lost this battle to Ai. They probably never got in Ai to steal anything anyway. But that's Johnny's mistake. That's not necessarily got anything with the lesson. The lesson we need to keep in our hearts from the very first, from all three battles, is that we need to follow God's commands. It's our job to do the study to know what God wants us to do. And then it's our job to apply that study, to follow His commands the way they're written. It's not our job to improve it. It's our job to follow the way it's written. Further, I think a lesson that we can learn from what happened here is, as long as the Israelites were unified, as long as they were following a single purpose, this all worked. Go back to Jericho. What if one of the tribes had just said, we can't make it on the seventh day? You know, they'd walked around the city one time a day for 6 days. Well, what if one tribe had said, our feet are tired, we're not going to make it on the seventh day. You all go on and everything will work out. We're going to stay here. What if, in the battle of Achan, what if the 5,000 or whoever was set in ambush, what if they decided to jump the gun before the king of Ai started following Joshua and his people out? It wouldn't have worked either, would it? We all have to pull the same way to have the right results. Okay, I appreciate your comments, and if you have more, let us know. Thank you for coming.